Last month, when Israeli police moved in to evict a Palestinian family, protesters accused Israel of trying to push out the entire community from Jerusalem. A new report by Amnesty International goes much further, pointing to the walls that surround the occupied West Bank, the destruction of Palestinian homes there, and the spread of Israeli settlements.
Our conclusions may shock and disturb.
The group says Israel's laws and policies amount to institutionalized oppression for the benefit of Jewish Israelis.
Amnesty International is here today to call on the authorities of Israel to put an end to the system of apartheid it is maintaining against all Palestinians living under their effective control.
That drew an angry response, targeting Amnesty.
It isn't a human rights organization, but just another radical organization which echoes propaganda without seriously checking the facts. Instead of seeking the truth,
Israel insists it needs many of these measures to ensure its security. The assumption has long been that things will improve once there's a peace deal, creating two separate states, one Palestinian, one Israeli. But experts say the debate is shifting, no longer between two nations,
but rather as a conflict, almost like a racial conflict.
Oded Haklai studies the growing perception of a split based on racial inequality.
And if it's seen as such, then the solution is no longer in terms of partitioning the territory into two nation states, but of fixing racial hierarchies within a single territory.
And that, he says, is a much tougher problem to solve than redrawing borders. Sasha Petrusik, CBC News, Toronto.
Latest news, Israel. Headliner, Israel calls on Amnesty not to release the apartheid report. Associated Press, dated January 31st, 2022. Israel on Monday called on Amnesty International not to publish an upcoming report accusing it of apartheid, saying the conclusions of the London-based international human rights group are false, biased, and anti-Semitic. Amnesty is expected to join the New York-based Human Rights Watch, and the Israeli rights group B'Tselem is accusing Israel of the international crime of apartheid based on its nearly 55-year military occupation of lands the Palestinians want for a future state because of its treatment of its own Arab minority. Israel dismissed the other reports as biased, but is adopting a much more adversarial stance this time around. Foreign Minister Yair Lapid has said Israel expects intensified efforts this year to brand it as an apartheid state in international bodies and hopes to head them off. In a statement issued Monday, he said Amnesty is just another radical organization which echoes propaganda without seriously checking the facts, and that it echoes the same lies shared by terrorist organizations. Israel isn't perfect, but we are a democracy committed to international law, open to criticism, with a free press and a strong and independent judicial system, Lapid said. Amnesty did not immediately respond to a request for comment. The Foreign Ministry said in a statement that Amnesty's report defies the state of Israel's right to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people. Its extremist language and distortion of historical context were designed to demonize Israel and pour fuel onto the fire of anti-Semitism, it added. Neither Human Rights Watch nor B'Tselem compared Israel to South Africa, where an apartheid system based on white supremacy and racial segregation was in place from 1948 until the early 1990s. Instead, they evaluate Israel's policies based on international conventions like the Rome Statute, which defines apartheid as an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression, domination by one racial group over any other racial group. They argue that Israel's various policies in the territories under its control are aimed at preserving a Jewish majority in as much of the land as possible by systematically denying basic rights to Palestinians. Israel says its policies are aimed at ensuring the survival and security of the world's only Palestinian state. The International Criminal Court is already investigating potential war crimes committed by Israel and Palestinian militants in the occupied territories. After last year, Gaza's war, the UN Human Rights Council set up a permanent commission of inquiry to investigate abuses in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, including systematic discrimination and repression based on national, ethnic, racial, or religious identity. Israel has accused both the International Criminal Courts and the United Nations rights body of being biased against it. Al Jazeera headliner, Israeli Defence Minister Gantz makes surprise visit to Bahrain, dated February 2nd, 2022. Israeli Defence Minister Benny Gantz has arrived in Bahrain on an unannounced visit amid heightened tensions in the Gulf after missile attacks on the United Arab Emirates by Yemen's Iran-aligned Houthi movement. Announcing Gantz's trip only after his arrival in Manama, Israel's defense ministry said on Wednesday he would sign a security cooperation agreement with Bahrain, which, along with the neighboring United Arab Emirates, normalized relations with Israel in 2020. The UAE on Monday intercepted a missile during a visit by Israel's president, the third such attack in 2 weeks, claimed by the Houthis, who are battling a Saudi-led coalition that includes the United Arab Emirates. In disclosing Gantz's official visit, the Israeli Defense Ministry made no mention of the Houthi attacks, nor gave details of what security accord with Bahrain, home to the U.S. Navy's main Gulf, would include. The U.S. said it was sending fighter jets to assist the UAE following the missile attacks. Gantz flew to Bahrain on an Israeli Air Force transport plane. It was the first time an Israeli defense chief had visited the Gulf nation, or that an Israeli military aircraft had landed there. Gantz wrote on Twitter, "Honored to be here and looking forward to the meeting the kingdom's leaders." The U.S. brokered the Abraham Accord signed by Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel, built on common commercial interests, and worries about Iran, Sudan, and Morocco followed suit, formalizing ties with Israel. In September, Bahrain hosted Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid for the highest level visit since the normalization deals were reached. Forces from the UAE, Bahrain, Israel, and the United States Naval Forces Command held a naval exercise in the Red Sea in November of 2021. Israel said such military cooperation could help counter Iran's power projection in the region. That's the latest news, and now my thoughts. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict goes back to 55 years, with the majority of the problems starting in 1966. It seems, and I don't want to make any faulty predictions, it just seems that this is going to be a conflict that is going to be resolved dead last. The Arab countries in the region are absolutely at fault for allowing this to continue, because the Arab countries that spoke out against the Palestinian conflict have been destabilized by the US coalition under influence by the Israeli Conference, AIPAC, and their leaders in the Likud party. During the last 40 years, I would say, the countries that have been speaking out on the Palestinian problem, such as Syria, Libya, Lebanon, and Iran, have been under constant assault by the United States, and Israel is being the antagonist. Now, As for the Arab countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Bahrain, these ghouls basically are just lackeys of the United States. They are not going to interfere on behalf of the Palestinians because when Saudi Arabia first came to existence with the Wahhabis from the Najad, which is one of the main cities that was captured by Ibn Saud from the Ottoman empires, one of the leading constitutions of Ibn Saud was that he was not going to interfere with the Palestinians. And for years, this has been leveraged by the Saudis, even though they don't do anything about it. Now, the Amnesty International report, this is not new. I mean, there have been international reports that have come out over the years, which basically have been calling for the end of the illegal settlements happening north of the country. Now, this is coming from the Israeli religious settlers called the Haredi, or the Hilltop Youth. And these people basically ironically, they're against Zionism, but because they are Jews, they have that commonality where they agree that Israel has to be a Jewish state. Israeli settlers remind me of ISIS, the extremist, ultra-Orthodox Arab fundamentalist group based in Syria and Iraq, the Islamic State. They also believe that the caliphate, which has to be under the principles of the Salafi brand of Islam, and they too believe that no foreign nation or government can govern the Arab world, only they can. And this is a consistent finding with religious extremists in that they are the only voices for God, and that their tenets basically should be adopted by the rest of the world. The Amnesty International report, and this is going back to the Goldstein report, which basically outlined the number of atrocities regarding Gaza, and it was slammed until Goldstein had to back out of the report. Now, the report itself called for the end of the conflict and how Israel is committing, I'm sorry, not the Goldstone report, written by Richard Goldstone, who is the chair of the Goldstone Commission, the Commission of Inquiry regarding the prevention of public violence and intimidation. And this was appointed in 1991. Now, but the commission played a critical role in diffusing the political violence that erupted when apartheid in South Africa began eroding in the late 1980s. That just goes to show you that there are similarities between the two. But Richard Goldstone, when he wrote his report, Israel, even though he is Israeli, was basically slammed for it by his own country. He was forced basically to retract some of the report's findings regarding the during the Gaza war between Israel and Hamas in December of 2008, where the UN Human Rights Council passed a resolution condemning Israel for grave violations of human rights abuses. Israel, by the way, under Benjamin Netanyahu, refused to cooperate with the investigation called by the Goldstone report and accused even the Human Rights Council, which is not new. As I read the news to you today, they do the same thing. This is 11 years ago, of anti-Israel bias. That's always the default position of these people in Israeli government. Always call them anti-Semites, but that's hardly going to work anymore. So I hate to be a pessimist, but unless the United States and the United Nations get on board, which is at this point a very extremely low improbability, there's going to be no leverage with these human rights groups to try and force the issue of human now. But not to say that there's some optimism here, because the rest of the world outside the United States is basically calling for the attention. Now, I must give a lot of credit to people in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Iraq. So outside of the Gulf, the Arab world is basically trying to call attention to this crime. And, Ireland, Sweden, Netherlands, these countries deserve a lot of credit, because they also are calling out Israeli crimes that are happening. And they are crimes. As for Israel's meeting in Bahrain, well, this is just a strategic partnership. That's all this is. They don't care about what's going on in Bahrain or any other Arab country. Now, they have no commonality with these people. We're talking about the Israeli government. Look what they're doing to Palestinians. Do you think they're going to care about what's going on in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia? No. What they're doing is just trying to separate one Arab country from another. So in other words, they're trying to isolate Iran. So they go to the Gulf countries. They go to Saudi Arabia. Israel has no commonality whatsoever with Saudi Arabia. They have no commonality with Bahrain. They have no commonality with the United Arab Emirates. These countries were once based on the principles of Wahhabism, which is anti-ethical to Islam. It's not Islamic. So you wonder why Israel is doing this. Now, are they trying to secure themselves in the region? Sure. But are they trying to isolate the one country that is left on the map for war regarding the Middle East, which is Iran? Yes. And when you look at the United States and Yemen relations, well, there is none. Even though Yemen became a key site for U.S. intelligence gathering following the USS Cole bombing in the year 2000, and considering that Yemen was once the second city outside of, say, Afghanistan, home to Al-Qaeda hubs. And that's no longer the case. Now, there are some Al-Qaeda affiliates there, but as for the old Al-Qaeda, no, they barely exist as it is. Now, you do have the remnants of like the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and these are all just the affiliates and remnants of the old Al-Qaeda and their lineage, which is passed on to these, ghoulish CIA-backed groups that are trying to overthrow the democratically elected governments in their Arab countries. But that was always the case with Al-Qaeda, which is basically, they affiliated themselves with the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Now, if you look at the history of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, they wanted to overthrow the Arab governments, and they brought that ideology into Al-Qaeda, which is the reason why they started doing terrorist attacks on the United States. But before their partnership, Al-Qaeda was not a terrorist organization. In terms of Yemen, look, the United States promised, and I'm talking about Joe Biden, before he was even in office, one of his main promises that he ran on the election campaign was to stop the financial support of Saudi Arabia in Yemen. The first month he was in office, he gave a large financial aid deal to Saudi Arabia and a military aid package that went strictly to Yemen. And as of right now, I believe it's in the hundreds of thousands, in the high ups, in terms of deaths. I think it's over 1 million. I don't know the exact number, but it's the largest human rights violation. It's the largest human rights crime in the world. It's the most egregious crime. It's the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world right now, and the United States is a major part of it. And for Israel to go to the United Arab Emirates, and this is only because they want to separate them from the conflict and protect them from blowback by the Houthis, which are backed by the Iranians and Lebanon. And this is what's happening, is that they're trying to close off any direct ports from Iran to Lebanon to Syria. These are the main countries that will come to Iran's aid once the conflict happens. And when I say once, I think it's a foregone conclusion at this point that the Iran war will happen in the next 4 years. It could be sooner. It all depends who the Republicans are going to vote in for office. It's not going to happen under the Biden administration. They basically created the they facilitated the economic sanctions, and they still are, which happened under the Trump administration. Goes to show you that when it comes to war, there is no two parties, there's only one. So we need to speak out. We need to start bringing attention to the light of a potential conflict that serves no purpose but to the interests of the Pentagon, the CIA, the private military industrialists, Saudi Arabia, and Israel.